Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to today's webinar, Unobtrusive Validation in ASP.NET MVC, presented by Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. In this webinar, Don will go in depth into how to set up custom unobtrusive validation in ASP.NET MVC. See him live code a new validation attribute which allows you to perform conditional validation. Plus, learn about the internals of the validation system so you can create your own reusable validation attributes, which is incredibly useful for your forms validation. FYI, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Don.
Hi, validation is an important aspect of software development. It not only ensures that the data received from the end user is correct, but it also secures our application against hacking. Particularly on public-facing websites, this is a very important aspect. So, why is it important? Imagine you have a web page with a form where you request a user's name. If you are not validating the input of the user, and he or she enters some SQL commands like drop table instead of a name, very bad things could happen. Recently, Mahul, Harry and I did a webinar on unobtrusive JavaScript validation with DevExpress ASP.NET MVC. This webinar is available on our YouTube channel. We received quite some interesting questions after the webinar, where this one of them was about custom validation. We showed you how easy and fast validation is implemented by putting validation attributes on top of C# properties, where the jQuery validation engine will make sure these properties are being validated on the client as well, to improve the end user's experience without any additional work. The jQuery validation engine is one of the oldest plugins of the jQuery system, and Microsoft ships this with the MVC framework. The unobtrusive validation system for MVC is for MVC only, because of the nature of MVC, where for web forms the DevExpress controls have other great validation features, which include client and server-side validation, but we will not be covering them in this webinar. If you are interested in a webinar on the web forms validation, don't hesitate to contact me on any of the contact details shown on the last slide of this webinar. The MVC framework includes a lot of those attributes, from simple required attributes to credit card and phone number validation. Today's webinar will introduce you to some internals of this MVC validation engine, and I will show you how to create your own validation attribute which can be reused on different projects. I will show you how to create a slightly more advanced attribute where validation is depending on the value of another property in the model. Let me show you the end result of what I will build during this webinar. Here you see a checkout form that I have extracted from a running e-commerce application. I have built this in the past, and yeah, you will need to enter some details before you are allowed to check out. If I click the button Proceed with Checkout, you'll notice that there are a couple of fields required, and one of them is the shipping address, and the other one is the billing address. In a lot of situations, the shipping address is the same as the billing address. So if you want to enrich the end user experience, yeah, you should in that case only need to enter that address information once. So what you see on a lot of sites is that there is a little checkbox which says billing same as shipping or something similar. And if I tick this box on this particular checkout form, then I indicate to the system like, okay, I don't need to enter an additional billing address which appears to be the same as the shipping. So in that case, the form also don't need to validate the billing address. So let me hit the button again, so it will validate all over again. And what you'll notice here is that the billing address does not longer fail on the validation. Well, this is the attribute that I'm going to build during this webinar, because this validation of the billing address is depending on the checkbox, which is another property in the model. So I'll also show you the code necessary for this kind of validation. And for that, I have a little application. Let me get it in. And what you see here is the model that has been bound to this form. It's got the first name, it's got the middle name, and the last name. Here the required attributes are put on top of the first name and the last name. Also the shipping address is required. And then we'll get the billing address. And the billing address has a different type of attribute. And this is the attribute that I'm going to build for you, because this required when attribute is depending on another property in the model. And that property happens to be the billing same as shipping property. If I go inside this attribute constructor and I will execute the code completion, then you'll see that there are two parameters required, and one is the property name of the property we're depending on, and the value. So in our situation, if the value of this property is false, then this billing address is required. If the property is true, if this checkbox is true, or actually this property holds a value of true, then the required validation is not required for this model. So let me get back to the slides, because there was one thing that I wanted to show you before we can go into code. There are basically 3 steps involved in setting up this custom validation attribute. First, we need to create the validation attribute class, and this is our required when attribute class, and that will be derived from the validation attribute which comes with the MVC framework. The second step, inside that same C# class, we need to implement the server-side validation, because this whole unobtrusive validation mechanism is doing its work client-side as well as server-side. So we need to do the server-side check. And the last thing that we need to do is we need to extend the jQuery validation engine to perform the client-side validation. So in other words, we need to hand over a couple of things that we will be using inside this C# attribute class. We need to hand it over to the client so it can be used inside the JavaScript validation. I'll come to that at the last step of our coding. So let me go to Visual Studio, where I have prepared a small application which is basically the same as the running one that you just saw. This application is a standard MVC application that I have created by using the DevExpress template gallery. For everybody who hasn't seen this, this is a really cool project template gallery. I will not finish this off, but if you go to Visual Studio C# and you select the DevExpress template gallery, then you are able to set up an empty application with all DevExpress references set correctly. We have a couple of videos on our YouTube channel which show you how it works, but I would rather ask you to try it out yourself if you haven't done so. This, the result of this project template is the application that you see right here in my project Explorer. What I've done, I've set up this person class that we're looking at right now. And in this case, I haven't included that required when attribute because we have to build it. What I've done further is I have changed the index razor view, which is bound to the person model, and I have set up our DevExpress grid view extension. The same with the edit and the insert views. I have removed the standard produced code and I've set up a nice form layout extension from DevExpress, which allows us to align the controls really nice, and that was what you have been seeing on this form. So let me switch back to the form. All these controls are being aligned and layouted by our form layout extension. So those are the only things that I've changed basically. Well, we have seen the model and we have seen the rest of the stuff. So let's get started by creating this attribute class. I will call it the required when attribute. And what I'm doing right now is not really a best practice, but for the demo it's good enough. You should consider storing these kind of attributes and logic inside a separate assembly, so it makes it way easier for you to reuse these attributes in other projects as well. But for the demo purpose, I'll put it in this application. So if I switch back to the slide deck quickly, we noticed that the first step was create the actual validation attribute class. And this validation attribute class is going to be derived from the validation attribute. It will also implement the interface that you see here, but I'll get to that just a bit later. So let me code that in. And all these validation attributes are inside the system component model.data annotations namespace. So we need to put that on our file as well, just like this. And now we can start putting in some logic. As you saw in the demo and also in the code that I have been showing you, there were two parameters on the constructor of this attribute. One was the depending on property, and the other one was the target value. I will just implement these as simple public properties with no special effects whatsoever. So they'll be just get sets. I am going to use some functionality of the required attribute, which is already existing in the system.componentModel.data annotations. So it might be a good idea to just reuse that required functionality, and that can be done by just taking up a private member which holds an instance of this required attribute, just like this. Well, once this is set up, we can implement a constructor, and that constructor will only be used to hand over the depending on property parameter and the object, the target value, and hand them over and put them in the properties of this attribute. Not much rocket science so far. If I now go back to my slide deck, we need to do something else. We need to perform the server-side validation in C#. And for that, we have to override the isValid method. And if I go back to Visual Studio, and I'm gonna override this, you'll notice that there are two overloads of the isValid method. The first one is like the easy one, and it will do a call to the second one. But the second one is more interesting for us because we need to get access to another property of this same object that we are validating right now. So for that we will need to access the validation context, and that makes it happen that we need to override this second method. Well, it will obviously finish my code by returning the base result. So let me remove that. The first thing that I will need to do is I will need to get the property value of that depending on property. But I have a string representing the name of that property. So I will need to use a bit of reflection to access it. And for that, I will first need to get a type to the specific object that we are validating, the model. The next step is to have access to that specific property information, and that is going to be done by a bit of reflection. And because we're using the property info, we need to resolve the system reflection namespace as well. Once we have this set up, I will obviously do a bit of checking to make sure that the prop info is unequal to null. And if the property info is null, so in other words we have made a typing error in the parameter, the depending on name, or the property still just doesn't exist or whatever, then there is also no need for us to do the required check. So in that case we can just say return validation result dot success. Before we can do the actual validation, so we have to check the value of that property against the target value. We need to get it, and we can do that just by calling the method getValue from the property info object. Once we have done that, it is a convenient way of checking a number of things. So for instance, if one of the two objects is null, or one of the two objects is something that we are not expecting, then we could get like a runtime exception or something. We don't want to have that, so I'm going to do a bit of checking here. And if everything is okay for comparison, I can just call the isValid method of this private member that we have been creating here, just like this. And I will also just, in case the validation fails, I will return the validation result with an error message and the validation context of member name. So we'll have like the validation message. So with this in place, we have also implemented step 2 of our little checklist. So let me get back. If I go up fast, so we have now done step 1 and step 2, and we are now ready, almost ready to perform step 3. As I was mentioning at the beginning of this coding session, there are a couple of things that we need in the JavaScript portion of this validation mechanism, so we can do client-side validation as well. And the two things that we need to hand over from the server to the client are, in our situation, the depending on property and the target value. Or yeah, we need to know on the client as well where we are depending on. So to make that happen, there is an interface that can be implemented, and that interface is the iClient validatable interface. And this also shows you that this is MVC specific, because this interface has been declared in the system.web.mvc namespace. So this client validatable interface only requires us to implement one method. And if I go down, then you'll see that this method is called the getClientValidation_rules, and it returns an IEnumerable with one or more model client validation rules. And these rules hand over some crucial information to make this all work on the client as well. Let me get rid of this default line of code. And what we're basically going to do is I'm going to create one of those rules. So one of these. And that is being done by just creating it. And there are two properties which are important at this stage. That is the error message, which is also used in the server-side portion when some error message has been produced. Here it is. And we need the validation type. And the validation type is a string with a unique name for your validation code, which identifies what we need to do when validating on the client. I'll get to that later when we're doing the JavaScript code. What I now need to do is I want to have the property name, and I need to convert that into an element ID, because the MVC framework is using a specific pattern to generate element IDs for the editors in the client. And I am going to do a bit of transforming there to make sure that I have the element ID that I need to check on the client, so the HTML element ID. And that is done by the following lines of code. Because I know how this this generation of the ID works, and you can find it out pretty easy by looking in one of the rendered source pages. And then you'll notice how this is being constructed. As you can see, the MVC framework has a function which will return the full HTML field ID. So that's pretty easy. So in this stage I have the element ID which will be used in the HTML on the client. Now the only thing that we need to do is add a number of parameters to this specific validation rule. And we're going to add two parameters. One is the depending on property which will hold the HTML element ID of the editor, which is we need to check. And this will be the target value, and we'll be handing over the target value in this parameter value. So now we have set up this rule. We only need one rule in this configuration, and because we only need one rule, we can just use the yield keyword to return the rule like this. So with this in place, we are now ready to proceed to step 3 of the little checklist, because we have made the proper preparations. And if you want to do your own validation, you can add as many parameters as you want, and I'll show you in a second how we're going to retrieve those parameters on the JavaScript side and do something with it. Let me perform a quick build to see that I have resolved all namespaces and I didn't make any typing errors. And this is building, so I can now go to the JavaScript portion, which was step 3. So we are now at the point that we need to extend the jQuery validation engine to perform my custom validation. And for that to happen, because this plugin, this validation plugin, has a collection of methods, and those methods are validation methods. They are identified by a name, and they have a function which will do the validation itself. So let me switch back to Visual Studio, and I will add a file here, and it's going to be a JavaScript file. The name that I will choose is obviously completely up to you, but I like to keep it a bit structured, so I will call it jQuery custom validation required when.js. So here we are, and this file is obviously completely empty. The code that we need to do, to create, only needs to be initialized once. So for that, it is most easy to use the jQuery's approach for the self-executing function. So that is basically a function that we declare, and this function is called automatically, executed automatically once the browser or the parser reaches this specific point. The construction looks like this, and this makes sure that this code has been called once. So I was mentioning before, we now need to add a validation method to the validator object. And we can do that by, or at least I can do that by executing a little CodeRush template that I have prepared for this. And as you can see, this method requires a name and a function. This method name is going to be required when. And let me put an I in there as well. And as you can see, the second parameter of this add method is a function which will do the actual validation. It is very important that this name here is exactly the same as the one that we have been specifying with the validation type. Because if that doesn't match, the two will not find each other at the other side, and validation will just not appear. So I'll better make sure that I didn't make any typos, so I will copy this validation type and just paste it in here, so I know it's gonna find each other somewhere in the middle. As said, the second parameter is a function. This function has three parameters. The first one is the value that we need to validate. The second one is the element which is used to edit or show this specific value. And the third one is a parameters object. And that parameters object is an interesting one because this parameters object will contain the parameters that we have been adding to this rule. So how that basically works, it's just a matter of requesting the parameters by name, and that is done by these lines of code. So the parameters is basically a name value list, and I will now get the depending on property and the target value. So now we need to do a check on the target value to make sure that it has some value other than null or undefined or whatsoever, so nothing will fail. And if it is undefined or null or whatever, I'll just make it an empty string. What we now need to do, we have the dependent control ID, we have the target value, so now we need to locate the editor or the control we need to check for its value. And I have made this code in a way that it can be used with DevExpress controls or DevExpress MVC extensions, but it can also be used without the DevExpress MVC extensions. So I have made a slight distinction on how to resolve that control and get its value. I will first show the DevExpress related code. What I do first is I'll check if we are dealing with DevExpress related JavaScript, and that can be done by this basically. What I try next is I will see if I can get one of those controls which has a name of dep control, and if that's the case, I need to make a slight separation, because if we are dealing with a checkbox, we don't want to get the checkbox value, but we want to know if it is checked or not. And just like with normal HTML elements, also for DevExpress, there is a specific method which is called getChecked on a checkbox. If we want to validate on another editor, for instance another text box or something, we can just call its getValue, because the rich client-side API of DevExpress have all these kind of methods in them, and that works really great. So just a small check whether we're dealing with a checkbox or not. I will basically do the same for HTML-based editors, so non-DevExpress related editors. Also there, I need to check if we are dealing with a checkbox, because in that case I will need to have its checked property, and otherwise I can just get its value. Otherwise I can just get its value right here. So this is, we have now the control, we've got a target value, so better safe than sorry, do some additional checks on the actual value, because we have the value already of the editor that we are depending on. Also again check if it is not undefined or null or something not comparable. And now we are ready to do the validation. Well, first we need to compare the target value with the actual value, and I'm doing that right here. And if that's the case, if they are equal, then I can again reuse the required method, because the validator holds this hash table with methods, and one of the methods is required. So I can just call that specific method to the client-side required functionality. If the target value is unequal to the actual value or whatever, then no validation is needed, so we can just return true. So with this in place, we have performed the client-side validation as well. But the title of this webinar was called Unobtrusive Custom JavaScript Validation. So for that to happen, we need to extend some other subsystem of this validator engine. And that is, the unobtrusive subsystem needs to know what to render out inside the HTML, the rendered HTML, to perform this unobtrusive validation. So where information is stored in HTML5 attributes, and the validator will check those attributes. So we need to add some stuff for that as well. Fortunately, that's done fairly simple, because there is something inside this validator object, and let me put in that code, which is called an unobtrusive object. So the validator object holds an unobtrusive sub-object, and that unobtrusive sub-object holds a list of adapters, and those adapters make it happen that those custom HTML5 attributes are being rendered out, so we can perform this unobtrusive validation. So let me first give a method name, and again, this method name should be equal to the one that we have been using with the validation method, so the two can be matched. And the second parameter that needs to be specified is an array of elements that will be rendered out in the final HTML. And in our situation, that will be depending on property and the target value. The third parameter of this add function of the adapters collection is a configuration thing. And let me remove the comment. Also for that, this function receives an options object, and we need to set a couple of things inside this options object. For instance, that options object has a collection with rules, and those rules are gonna have the same name again. There is one rule which has the same name as the adapter and also has the same name as the method. And we are gonna add a number of properties here, which is the depending on property and the target value. And those actual values are already stored inside this options object as parameters. And again, these depending on property and the target value correspond with the same items that we were sending out from the C# attribute class. So the names should also be equal. The last thing that we need to do is we need to render out some error message in case validation fails. And that options object has something for that, which is called the messages collection. And again, the message which comes with this validation is identified by a name, which is equal to the rule, which is equal to the adapter, and it's also equal to the validation method. So now we have prepared everything. So I've implemented the attribute, I've added the validation code server-side, and I've also implemented the client-side validation as well as the unobtrusive portion to make sure that it will happen. Before we can test it now, we need to do two additional steps. I have been coding in this jQuery, this JavaScript file, so we need to link it in. And also for the demo purpose, I'm just going to put it in the layout because I know that's been loaded with every page. And I'm just going to link it in right here. So a best practice would be to think out something to optional load this in once the requirement attribute has been used, but for this purpose I will just do it like this. The second thing that we need to do is use the attribute. So you see that the attribute is available here, and it has the parameters like we wanted. And to make it work in one go, I will copy in the property name, and the target value was going to be false. So let me copy in this, and we are now ready to go. Let me rebuild the project, and I should now be able to start it off. I'll close down the initial screen that I have been showing you. And after a couple of seconds, we should see the grid that was on the index. Yeah, here it is. The reason that I put in this grid is because I wanted to show you something right after we went to the create new link. So here is my order, my checkout order form. So let me hit the button proceed with checkout. As you can see, both address fields are required because in this scenario, the billing address is not the same as the shipping address. So if I now tick this box, I will hit the proceed with checkout again. You'll notice that I specified the billing address should be the same as the shipping, so there is no need for the user to fill in this address field, and validation is not required. So this seems to work. Now there was one thing that I wanted to show you as well. So let me hit back to the main view, the index view, and I have been putting this grid on this page. And the reason I did it is because I enabled inline editing and inserting of data. And what happens if I click New, and I'll click the Update button in one go, you'll notice that a couple of things are required. But as soon as I tick this box and hit Update again, you'll also notice that the billing address field is no longer required. And that is a great feature that we have with the DevExpress controls, because they also support this really cool unobtrusive JavaScript validation. And as you can see, my custom attribute is already working inside this grid. And this was a new item, but I can also, if I cancel this and I'll edit this one, if I untick this box, because I'm now editing, and I'll do the update, it says my billing address is required. So this is, yeah, so you have to develop this kind of validation once, and yeah, you can just reuse that throughout your projects, because yeah, if you set this up in a reusable way, then you can reuse it without too much effort on the next project. So basically this is what I wanted to show you, and Amanda, I don't know if there are like any questions.
Hey Don, yeah, we had a question come in from Nadeem. He asked about why do I have to add addition, deletion, and updating methods? Is this not built in?
You have to help me out a bit, because I'm not sure. I wasn't doing anything with deletion, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe he can rephrase the question a bit.
All right. So Nadeem, just if you can clarify, we asked him to already, but
okay.
I thought maybe you might have more insight than the rest of us did.
Yeah, maybe he was seeing some of the code from the standard MVC stuff. He was probably looking at the razor view code, I guess, the partial view maybe of the form. And I mean, that is just stuff which is generated, and I haven't put too much focus on that particular portion, because the thing that I wanted to do was the validation attribute. So we have another couple of MVC videos which will explain those kind of things on the YouTube channel. I think he was talking about that.
Okay, perfect. This question just popped up. Why choose MVC over web forms?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I mean, there are a lot of. It obviously depends on the desired functionality and a couple of other aspects, and they are well written down all over the web. And I mean, one of the things which might be interesting is that MVC, if you do an MVC project, it's easier to unit test specific business logic. In a lot of circumstances, you have more control over the produced HTML. As you might know, with web forms, there is a whole bunch of stuff rendered in where you don't have too much influence on. Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons why you should go for that one. I mean, a reason to stick with web forms is that it is pretty easy to implement. You have to write less code in most cases, as you have to do with MVC, and it both has their pros and cons.
Okay, great. So if you do have additional questions for Don, you can get them in now while we wait for those. I do want to let everyone know that our 15.1 launch schedule is up, and you can register for it right now on our webinars page at devexpress.com/webinars. They kick off June 1st at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. New controls optimized for universal apps, 15.1. Join Julian Bucknell and Paul Usher and explore our newest product line, Controls for Universal Apps. From our new grid to our charting library, we'll take you through a tour of everything we'll ship as part of this release. And they go all the way through Friday, June 5th. We cover, obviously, what's new for WinForms and WPF, what's new for ASP.NET and MVC, presented by Mehul, Harry, and Don. What's new for reporting and dashboards, and also what's new for DevExtreme 15.1. So again, those are up and ready for registration at devexpress.com/webinars. All right, Don, one more question came in from Fernando. Are they considering generating a visual interface for easy lines coding similar to web forms, considering that the aim is to accelerate the encoding process?
Well, I can tell you one thing. Microsoft isn't going to do it. And we already have like a nice wizard which you can use to create like the code used to create a grid or to create like a complex control that we have. But I mean, the thing with MVC is, yeah, you have to get in love with your keyboard because you have to do a lot more coding as you're used to with web forms. And Microsoft isn't gonna make any plans of making that smoother, as far as I know right now.
Hey Don, hey Amanda, it's Mehul. Let me just jump in real quick. Those are both great questions, Cyril and Fernando. And as Don mentioned, there's pros and cons. I would say also, to add to what Don said, is that when you choose MVC, you have to accept that you will not have a visual designer. Nothing that Microsoft has said currently indicates that they are going to add that. Now, what they're saying is, the web is very different. Web development has changed a lot since web forms came out over 10 years ago. So they're kind of going towards that trend. So in fact, in the ASP.NET, vNext, all those new technologies, they're taking other approaches. That is not to say that web forms is outdated or anything like that. In fact, web forms is also getting updates in the next ASP.NET release. They're getting HTTP2 support and a couple other things. But for the most part, just decide. You can make both platforms very visually powerful using either our MVC extensions for MVC or our web forms controls for web forms. You can make them both unit testable. Web forms also supports the concept of models now, the same thing that MVC does. So the choice really comes down to whether or not the resources you have in your enterprise or in your company. Do they know MVC? Do they know web forms? What will it take to use one versus the other? So you have to weigh a lot of those pros and cons. So I would say, don't necessarily believe, any particular hype about one is more performant or one is better for this. As Don said, they both have their pros and cons. And instead of looking at the framework and going, I'm only going to use MVC when there's something visual for it or when it helps me code faster. There's a lot of MVC developers. They say, I always want to code. I don't want a designer. So, if web forms works for you, maybe you should stick with it. However, MVC appeals to you, and the way MVC is streamlined for sort of modular approach and a lot more control over the code and so forth, then use MVC. And as Microsoft, the program manager there says, choose what makes you happy at the end of the day. At DevExpress, we will support you in either way, right? All our powerful major extensions and controls are available for both platforms with similar API, similar feature set. Sorry, that's just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mehul.
Sure.
All right, so that is it for the questions, Don.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and let's get validating.
Awesome. Again, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I did post the link in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Don. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.